Justine. So we're gonna talk tonight about like boundaries and polyamory, and with the polyamorous kind of like movement, so to speak, growing and gaining popularity. One of the effects it seems to have had on like mainstream culture is people starting to get the idea that relationships are actually something you can negotiate, and they're like contracts that you can form with other people, not maybe just a package deal that you either buy into or you don't. So, like, what do people, you know, not even necessarily in romantic or sexual relationships, but just broadly, like, what do people in relationships owe each other?
Mm. It's a good question. I feel like the simple answer is probably honesty and communication about what you need. I mean, obviously, there's more things to add on to that, but I feel like foundationally, like honesty with those people, with yourself about what you want.
Mm. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I think that's definitely where I would want to, excuse me, where I'd want to start at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and
A- And I think,
kind,
like, for me personally, like, one of the biggest things that I want whenever a friendship is developing or a partnership is developing is I want them to be as aware of my boundaries as clearly as possible. Like, as soon as it looks like we're starting to look like something might develop, right? Because some boundaries are going to be deal breakers for some people, and I feel like I owe it to them to at least be honest about where I am and what the possibilities are and what possibilities aren't, so they can make a more informed decision about what they want their involvement to be.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny, like as we kind of start getting into it, I feel like another thing that we owe the people that we're engaged with is respect for those boundaries, their bodily autonomy, respect for everything. It's probably another thing that I would probably add.
yeah, I think, yeah, that makes perfect sense. People definitely want to feel respected and seen when they're, committing to like a long-term relationship of any shape or color with somebody. Uh, and kind of with that in mind, as we talk about like the growth of polyamory and society changing, like do you see those changes in society already? Like as people are, kind of realizing that I don't have to hold on to this like sort of religious mindset of what a relationship is, that it's this like forever bond between two people and two people alone. Do you think that's already having an impact?
Um, yes and no.
Mm.
So I'm in Texas. That's where I currently am. And I feel like it's really hard for people inside the community, outside of the community, to kind of let go of that measure of like success is staying together and not breaking up. That is like what relational success is.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's really hard for people to let go of that. And I feel like that comes from like, toxic, religious, monogamous kind of scripting. Um, yeah, I feel like that's really hard to let go in general. Um, Even polyamorous people, when things end, when relationships end, like maybe this means that I'm not cut out for polyamory. Maybe this means that polyamory is not viable. That like narrative continues to kind of even interject in their minds then too. It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think you see that a lot, right? That when people kind of feel like they've like failed, maybe they default to like, oh, were these like values that were instilled in me so early from this kind of like archaic like origin, are those like maybe real? Maybe I failed because I didn't live up to those standards or something like that.
Yeah, and that's
Um,
definitely the feeling that I got growing up in my environment, that, it's like I had an idea in my head of what I wanted relationships to be. It does not match the idea that the people who raised me would want my relationship to be. And there was that little struggle there as to, what, it's my life, it's my relationships, I want to conduct them as I see fit, even if it doesn't fit any particular mold or any particular established structure. And I think there might even be some tension where, people are taught this is the model, and they don't feel like that model fits for them.
yeah, I think probably lots of people, even people watching right now, feel that way and maybe are just kind of coming around to the idea that maybe there are other ways to negotiate contracts and relationships for them that could be like different than what they're used to. And with that in mind, like what kinds of things should we be negotiating in these contracts? Like what is central to our autonomy that we should fight for, and what's maybe like fair game for negotiating?
Man, I mean, I feel like that answer is going to be different for everybody. I immediately wanted to say like everything is fair game. I don't know why that was my impulse. That was my initial impulse. Like everything should be fair game. And I think this is like where I kind of say, if different relational orientations is something that you're kind of trying to get into, you have to know yourself very well. Who you are, what you want, where you are willing to budge and where you're not, so that you can kind of know that information from the jump when you do kind of enter into these relational negotiations with individuals. Yeah, man, that's hard.
No, I think it's a beautiful question, because when we talk about boundaries, typically we're talking about romantic relationships or sexual relationships. But how many times have we gotten calls, Arden, on other shows where people want to set the boundary of, I don't want to have this type of conversation with you, right? So it's this is why I love doing these shows, because the things that some people do that are just second nature in unorthodox relationships, they actually have interesting mirrors in, we'll just call them, the more mainstream relationships, that they can learn from the people who have been engaging in this long time. Like boundaries are for friends too, or they're for family, and by learning how to establish your boundaries in a relationship, you can start to apply those ideas to how to set up healthy boundaries just with your friends or coworkers, or people who aren't necessarily involved with you in a relationship way.
Yeah, that's funny because like I do feel like, me developing my own boundaries within my relationships has helped me develop boundaries with my family, which I feel like is in general a place where boundaries don't get adhered to all that much. Like I hear a lot of like, well, they're family, they're blood, like they're always going to be around, as that like kind of writing off as like whatever they're going to do to you, whatever, their blood, they got to stick around. And it's like, no, like I've learned that, I can kind of determine what my relationships look like relationally, like romantically and sexually. The same thing should hold true for family. Like you should be able to also navigate, talk about, negotiate those boundaries with family too. They shouldn't just have like carte blanche to do whatever it is that they want to do to you. So yeah.
No, and coming from the culture that I did, where certain boundaries just don't exist, and where people feel that getting to kibitz in your relationship is just part of a parental or grandparental or other family member right? Like one very popular one is, when am I going to get grandkids, right? Now,
Yeah.
the traditional answer to that is, if you want grandkids, you can have your own. But really, like, there's this idea, and it makes me wonder if they grew up in that and felt just fine in that framework, where they said, they were taught, this is how you're supposed to have a relationship, this is how you're supposed to have a marriage and a family. They're fine with it. It's a model that fits them, which, fine, it works for a lot of people, that's great. But then when you find that one really weird person like me who it doesn't fit for, then it even makes it stronger, look like there's something wrong with that one person who can't seem to make it work. And then it's seen as my problem that I can't make it work, rather than the problem of having toxic expectations being put on you that really don't have much of a basis, like a really good foundation. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I feel like I could talk about culture and polyamory like for a long time. So like,
Oh,
don't
please
get me
do.
started on that.
yeah, it makes me curious, because, like, I'm Pacific Islander, and my family like, I always tell people, if you want to have a good idea of what my upbringing was like, watch the Joy Luck Club, because there's a lot there that I absolutely definitely related to. So I'd be super curious as to how different cultural expectations meet or intersect with poly families and relationships.
Yeah, yeah. I'm I'm Hispanic, So I do get a lot of the like, well, when are you going to give me grandbabies rhetoric? And especially here recently, because I came out to my parents as polyamorous maybe a few years ago. And it's a lot of fear that I'm going to end up alone. I'm not going to be able to find someone that, you know, aligns with me in that orientation, that it's not going to stick, that I'm going to end up alone. And that's very like terrifying to my mom. She does not like that. So, I mean, in some ways, it kind of being polyamorous kind of goes against the grain of the collectivist part of my culture. And so much as like I have to just be me and not be afraid that I'm going to end up alone. I can't really be anything that settles me down into like a marriage where I'm compromising on things.
And then doesn't that hurt because it feels like, you know, like you have a partner that you know supports you, but you get the feeling that your family will never really support them because they're like, you know, it's like how can this person want to be with a person like you who wants to be in a poly relationship? So you don't feel like you get that your partner gets the support from your family that they ought to have.
Yeah, I mean, and it's too like on the other side of that, when things don't work out, it's always pinned on, well, like it was never going to work out. Like polyamory doesn't work. And that's usually, you know, to blame, or in my family's eyes, that is what's to blame for why relationships end, when it's actually rarely the case.
See, I told you before the show that like we have what we want to talk about, and then here we are, like we're 15 minutes in, we're already way out in the weeds. But just out of curiosity, you know, we talk about, you know, structures where polyamory and is definitely strongly against. Are there any cultures where because of the cultural awareness, it kind of greases the wheels for poly relationships? It's like easier for these cultures to accept someone who is poly. Have you ever run into anything like that?
Um,
I'm just curious. I genuinely don't know.
Honestly, no.
Monogamy is a
I'm
thing,
sure
huh?
they're out there. I'm sure it's a thing, but like, yeah, it's not something that I've come across, like, you know, naturally.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think we're obviously on like the ACA and we talk a lot about religion and stuff like that. I'm willing to bet that there is a significant impact of like sort of like a colonizer Christian religion having such a significant impact on the global culture that if those cultures did exist, we probably are not privy to that information as we might be in a different timeline. um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, kind of back on the sorry to rain it. This is a very interesting conversation. I do want to I think we can definitely keep talking more about this, but you know, kind of thinking back to like y'all are talking about you know, family requesting things from you and that maybe are crossing your boundaries and things like that. And I'm kind of curious, like within any of those relationships or with a partner, like do we have the right to limit like those kind of conversations about like those things, or maybe about like who we spend our time with, or who we can share our bodies with, or how or what we masturbate to and things like that?
Mm. I feel like the short answer is no. We don't have the right to limit what other partners want to do, or even what partners want of like what they think we should be doing. Um, but along that, though, I do feel that it's important for conversation when it comes to, you know, I know rules and boundaries is something that we're talking about right now. Conversation about rules and boundaries and just like how we conduct ourselves. I do feel like that should be collaborative. Everyone should have a say. Everyone should be able to voice their opinion. And you hope that there's enough respect and enough autonomy for those things to be heard and honored. Um,
Yeah.
where I feel like that gets difficult if someone just like comes out and is like, "You're not allowed to do that." Like, well, no, that's not how that should work. But if someone comes to me, you know, just sharing how they feel about something or what is coming up for them when I engage in this behavior or whatever, I'm more likely to engage collaboratively with that. That's how I feel like it should go on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that makes perfect sense. I can definitely relate from my own personal experience. I've had relationships where it's been either way, and so much so I feel like the predominant cultural narrative is that you fit into the box, like because that's just how it is. That when I've had partners like my current partner who are willing to like have conversations and negotiate, it's honestly kind of jarring. Like, oh wow, this is a conversation we're allowed to engage in. That's like it's almost uncomfortable in some
Mm.
ways. And I think that's kind of why this conversation tonight is so interesting about about the fact that I think probably a lot of people experience that discomfort when they're finding themselves able to negotiate at all. Yeah, and so I kind of want to now get into, we talked about like, you don't necessarily have the right to limit someone, but there should be like a collaborative effort. Like, how do we know what reasonable boundaries look like? And like to what extent is that just like us trying to control things or take away our partner's autonomy? And like how do we like separate those things?
I think that that self-awareness has to kind of come back into play there. If you can kind of sit down with yourself when you have certain reactions or emotions or thoughts to in response to like what a partner is doing or whatever, if you can kind of sit down with yourself and ask like, okay, what's going on for me here? What is it that I'm having a reaction to? What is it that I feel like is being threatened? What is it that I need? Can I communicate those things? um if you can kind of connect down into like the empathic root of whatever, I feel like that helps figure out, is this reasonable? Is this a reasonable ask? Is this a reasonable response or thought? Um, so I feel like that's a good place to start. I feel like that's another place where it's really difficult and a really vulnerable place for people to be.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, why I recommend everybody be in therapy. A therapist can kind of help with, that insight, and lead you through that kind of vulnerable insight. But I guess that's where I would start.
Okay, so I wanted to go back to, and it might be a purely semantic thing. It's something that you said a little while ago about one thing in relationships and therapy that I picked up was the difference between you statements and I statements, right? Like you can say, I feel invalidated by when this happens, as opposed to saying you're not allowed to do something that so I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about what the difference is between setting a boundary and creating a rule, or even if there is one, and maybe the only difference between a boundary and a rule is the way it's phrased. It's phrased as a like, I will not have a partner who is sexually active with other people, versus you're not allowed to have sex with anybody else or I'll leave you. So what are the fuzzy differences here between a boundary and a rule?
Mm. Um, that's like that's like a hot take in the polyamorous community, like rules and boundaries. It always like whips everybody up into a frenzy. Um,
That's
and
why we're
and part of
talking about it now. That's
On the edge of my
right.
seat. Yeah. Yeah.
Part of me thinks that like it's semantics. Like these feel like synonyms. They feel like the same thing. And then another part of me is like, well, no, like words matter. And how I feel comfortable defining it, how I've seen it defined, especially within the polyamorous community, is exactly what you're kind of already touching on. A rule is like, you can't do that. Like it's trying to put a prohibition on what people other than you should be doing or what should not be doing. And I feel like a boundary is more like, this is how I'm going to conduct myself. This is what I'm going to do. It's my behavior is the only behavior that I can control. And that's more of a boundary. Um, but I mean, once again, with that, I feel like all of that should be collaborative too. Like I have, I feel like they feel like hard and fast rules that I collaboratively arrived at with my partners. We all kind of came to a mutual understanding and agreement. This is how we're going to conduct ourselves. Is that a rule? I guess technically, because it's involving behavior of people that aren't me. But it's something that like we collaboratively came together on.
So talking about collaboration then, because there are some people who are fantastic about knowing what their boundaries are and expressing it to their partners. There are some partners who aren't as good at letting their partners know what they are. So it's not that the boundaries don't exist. They're there, but maybe they just don't know how to adequately communicate it. So how do we start to learn from our partners? Okay, what are your boundaries? What are your expectations? What are your limits? How do you start to have that conversation?
Very gently. You know, not in the middle of an argument. Something very like chill. And even, and this is funny too, because I feel like a little bit of my kink brain kind of kicks into this, and like these are the conversations that you have before you, I think you had already touched on it, that you have before you enter into a scene. You try to negotiate as much as you can. You try to know the terrain as much as you can before you're actually doing something. I feel like some of this you can sit down and you can talk to someone about, like, okay, well, this is how I want to be in this relationship, and you can do all the prep work, and then you get into the relationship and you kind of stumble across boundaries you didn't know were there for you, or you know, whatever, and then you kind of have to come up with things on the fly a little bit more. I think entering into those conversations respectfully, jointly, knowing that, you know, y'all are on the same side of the table, you're not in competition or in a fight with each other. Remembering that this is a person that you actually like and they're not your enemy. So try to cue into some empathy when, even if they're saying something that pisses you off or whatever, remembering that I think is important. Yeah.
No, I love what you said about talking about it before the scene, because there's admittedly small subset of the population who thinks that asking for permission, asking for consent kind of ruins the mood. But remember, we just talked about preparation in the what's turning you on. And the more you have the more you're working on making sure you're on the same page with each other before a scene or before engaging in a relationship, the less you have to ask in the middle of the scene. Like if you already know that something is going to be allowed or encouraged in a scene, if you've already talked about that ahead of time, you don't have to like get the assurance against like, hey, we're still good for no, because you already know, you've already talked about it. You can immerse yourself in the scene more because you've had these conversations ahead of time. That's just me.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, it's the same stuff with polyamory. Like there's so much conversation and communication and continuous communication that happens before someone enters into a relationship, I feel, when they're in it, just because like you just have to do that. Like I can't tell you how many times I've been in a conversation with someone, like we're on a dating app and I'm very clear about me being polyamorous and that I have other partners, and we talk about it initially and they seem to be okay with it, and then, you know, some time passes and then I'm having this conversation again. Like there's so much prep conversation that needs to happen. It's interesting.
Yeah,
And
I
just to
can.
answer Kay Lay's question in chat just really quick, no, it does not necessarily have to be. A polyamorous relationship does not necessarily have to be sexual, just like any other romantic relationship does not necessarily have to be sexual.